Hey there hunters, welcome back to the Gunners Guild. Today we're going to do another Let's Talk About video where I discuss and sort of review other games I've been playing but not really making content for. In today's video we're going to be discussing Lords of the Fallen. I don't really know if I want to call this a sequel to the original Lords of the Fallen because honestly, it's an entirely different game. Besides the world lore being the same, Lords of the Fallen shares almost nothing in common with the first game, and it's changed developer hands quite a few times, so it almost has nothing to do with the original title. While the original title was made by Deck 13, who went on to do things like The Surge and The Surge 2, Lords of the Fallen was picked up by CI Games, then given to Defiant, then taken back, and then CI Games formed Hexworks to specifically develop Lords of the Fallen, so it's just kind of jumped around a bit, and because of that, I don't really want to correlate these two games at all. And to me, they're entirely separate entities, and I know a lot of players and news outlets and stuff associate the poor first game with this new title, and often don't even give it a chance because of that, or maybe they judge it too harshly because it's supposed to have like this shared past, which is kind of outrageous to me. But anyway, I'm railing too much and haven't even talked about the game yet, so with that out of the way, let's discuss Lords of the Fallen. So before I start to pick apart the game, I want to lead by saying this. I can like games and still criticize them too. So you're going to be a lot of criticisms for this game, but I still like the game, and hopefully you'll see that because I have a lot to talk about it, and if I just didn't care for the game, I would just brush off aside and be like, meh. But I like the game. I just also have a lot of problems with the game. So Lords of the Fallen is the soulsiest game I've played in a long time, and what I mean by that is that this feels exactly what I expect from Dark Souls 4. It doesn't play or feel like a spin-off title or a B-team game or a low-budget indie game, but the overall gameplay experience is exactly the same as an actual full-fledged FromSoft Souls game. Had the name changed from Lords of the Fallen to Dark Souls 4, I guarantee you that no one would have voiced the same complaints about the game. I just believe people have some preconceived notions based upon the previous title and the IP, and of course they have to compare it to their beloved Dark Souls games, which is where I feel most of the criticisms come from. Because let's be honest, Dark Souls games are full of jank and bugs and outdated graphics and physics, wonky PvP netcode, you name it. But they get the pass, it's a Souls game. And that's not to say that Lords of the Fallen is perfect at anything, and I'll voice all my praise and criticisms, but I feel like it just gets too much unjustified flack. So with the second preamble out of the way, let's dissect this beast. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the graphics, the performance, and the overall general art direction. That's what I always do. And as you can no doubt see, Lords of the Fallen is a spectacularly good looking game. Being on the Unreal 5 engine and all, the general foliage, the density of objects, the lighting, it's all a big selling point to the UE5, and it always seems to deliver. Lords of the Fallen is definitely the best looking Souls game out there, next to Remnant 2, for a franchise that has typically never been graphically outstanding or leading the industry in any way. Now, raw graphics aside, Lords of the Fallen does still stumble in this area, mainly with the lighting presentation of this game, which is not very well implemented in my opinion. There are tons of areas in the game where you would transition between a cave and outside, or outside into a hut or a room, and the transition always seems to just mess up the lighting to the point where you really can't see anything for a bit of time while it dims and changes the lighting around, or you just have to get way past the transition area. And this makes traveling very scary because there could just be, and will be, enemies waiting to jump you as you cross these thresholds and you're just blinded to the world. Now outside of the transition areas, there are also quite a lot of dark areas in the game where you literally just cannot see and you have to fight enemies in total darkness. And while you do have a lantern, that thing is fucking for show and you can't actually use it in a fight. Because you can't actually use it for light and to swing a sword. But we'll get back to the lantern in a minute. Now lighting aside, the game is still graphically pretty amazing to look at, but the general art direction is kinda lacking in my opinion. While enemies, bosses, and the world visually look spectacular and unique and such, the color palette of the game is incredibly bland. Most of the game is browns, reds, and grays, and there's really not much else to see in the world other than the occasional short-lived grassy area. And while I loved each of the bosses and most of the enemies themselves, there's just a severe lack of enemy variety and you end up fighting yourself with the same dozen enemies over the entire game, which isn't unheard of these days, and while it's not an immediate deal breaker for me, it's kind of a letdown. So when you pair the drab color palette with the same old repetitive enemies, it just gets kinda old pretty quick. Now regarding the performance of the game, I actually have not had any significant issues with Lords of the Fallen at all, and I don't really know where all the complaints are coming from. while the resting area in Skycrest has pretty abysmal frame rate most of the time, and that's where most of the issues are, I feel. That's at least a safe area where nothing can happen. And pretty much all the other zones of the game, I ran a smooth 60 to 90 frames with the occasional stutter here and there, but nothing significant that would hamper my ability to play the game. And while I am on a PC with a 3070, I know some people have experienced significantly worse performance on the consoles, and even other PC players with a 4080 or 4090, but it also just seems that the 40 series cards don't like UE5 at all. Like every single UE5 game runs like shit on those. So performance isn't perfect, and yeah, I get that any stuttering is kind of blasphemous this day and age, but it's really not all that frequent, and I don't have any experiences with crashing overall, so I'm saying the performance is going to get a pass for me. I didn't find it that bad. I know a lot of people were giving it negative reviews based upon its performance, but I feel like most of that came from an early access period before like the day 1, day 2 patches that actually boost performance up a lot. So by the time I started playing the game, it was running like butter. Now next I want to talk about the gameplay loop. Lords of the Fallen is a Souls game. Like at its core, it's literally another Dark Souls clone. It plays exactly the same. The equipments, the items, the scaling, leveling, upgrading, dying, all of it's very familiar to anyone who's ever played a Souls game, which is understandable. It's entirely the audience for the game, what's it trying to appeal to. And I'm not going to sit here and try to explain a Souls game or gameplay features or stuff like that. You should know what a Souls game is by now, and if not, it's not important to you. But to tack on to the general gameplay that Souls games are known for, Lords of the Fallen also has incredibly snappy dodging, something that we've been lacking in the last few Souls games. And it also gives the players an insane amount of invincible frames on dodge, as well as having a very generous parry window. This isn't bad, as players like to feel that they can rely on the defensive tools given to them, but I feel like this is where the complaints for the game becoming too easy start to creep in. Anyone experienced with parrying and iframing in these kinds of games will be able to take full advantage of the generosity here and kind of steamroll a lot of the encounters and bosses that the game has to offer. While I feel there's enough challenge with the enemies and elites out in the world and trying to get from area to area, the boss fights tend to be rather easy to figure out and kill on the first or second or third try. Now when you pair the generous defenses with the incredible power scaling that this game has and gives players access to, you kind of end up steamrolling the entire second half of the game. It seems like everything is kind of overpowered at that point, but I also know that you're also kind of supposed to play New Game Plus where bosses and elites actually have HP, but I'm not expecting people to go back and play more playthroughs. Now, one of the main features in Lords of the Fallen is their Umbral, which is quite impressive, that the game is literally loading two worlds that overlap over each other. You have Axiom, the world of the living, and Umbral, the land of the dead. And you need to use your Umbral Lantern that was tossed to you because Destiny and Fate, and use this to travel between the two realms. When you die in Axiom, you respawn in Umbral, and then you get your second chance of life, kind of like Sekiro. So you can use the Umbral Lantern to peer into the Umbral and traverse obstacles or rip out souls of enemies to aid you in combat, but honestly, I don't like this lantern at all, and I feel like this thing was very poorly implemented, and they made this whole system and two-world thing to give Lords of the Fallen some gimmick. As I had mentioned earlier, this game is dark, and you have no light sources, besides this damn lantern, which is only active if you hold your fucking R button and move it up. But by holding up the lantern, you can also draw in enemies from the Umbral to attack you, and then they pull you in anyway, even though you just wanted a light. You also can't swing your sword or anything while you're holding the lantern, so there is no way to have a light source and fight at the same time. And using the lantern for fighting only has two purposes. You either use the lantern to suck the soul out of some wisps that are buffing enemies, which is just kind of tedious because all the wisps do is sit still and do nothing except make enemies immortal until the link is severed. And you just hold up the lantern and shine it on them for a second. It offers nothing to the combat flow, it's just something you have to do at the start of every elite or boss encounter, it seems. And again, you can't hold up a lantern and swing your sword, so you have to stop all your combat and shine your lantern on these things. It's really dumb. And the only other option you have with this thing is the Soul Flay, which are limited per life. Your Soul Flay rips out an enemy's soul and gives you a chance to damage them for a few seconds. And that's about it. There's really nothing all that impressive or insanely useful unless you happen to throw an enemy off a ledge, which is pretty rare. I only use the lantern when you have to, and you do have to. Part of the game is traveling between the worlds, and you'd think that there would be a lot of times you're trying to hold up the lantern to cross paths that you can't see in the Axiom to do things in the Umbral, but that's really not the case. Pretty much everything you do, you have to interact with in the Umbral plane, and you can only interact with them while in the Umbral plane. so you constantly have to use the lantern to just kill yourself to get to Umbral anyway to start interacting with objects and proceeding through puzzles and obstacles. And after a while I realized that there is no downside to just sitting in Umbral the whole time. There is nothing in the game that is blocked while you're in the Umbral world, and while there are things you actually can't interact with or pass through in Axiom. So by the second half of the game, where you're just kind of overpowered and steamrolling everything, I just traveled around entirely in Umbral so I don't miss anything. Sure, there's a red wraith that can hunt you down, but he's a big pushover. I don't know, I just found the whole lantern and Umbral system to be just like this item that is required to be used to play the game, rather than a cool gameplay feature that you want to use and interact with to find secrets and such. It feels really tedious. Outside of Lantern, the gameplay is actually very solid. Weapon movesets are great, and I love being able to attack and stance swap mid-combo to chain different attacks together. The kick is also incredibly snappy, unlike Souls games. It actually comes out reliably, though most of the time you try to kick an enemy off a cliff and they just get stuck on the terrain, which is definitely a big letdown. But when you pair the fluid weapon movesets as well as the generous iframes, it makes the game just feel incredibly smooth, despite making the game easier than some people may like. It still offers a very satisfying combat experience throughout the entire game, which is great because there are plenty of excellent boss fights and tough encounters to go through, which these are definitely the strongest parts about the game, and it kind of props up all of its lesser aspects. And at the very core, the combat and the boss encounters are like 80% of a Souls experience. So if that's good, like, it feels pretty easy to look past the other things. Now, while a lot of people don't like the world and zone travel, I thought that was one of the strongest features in Lords of the Fallen. Bonfires, or vestiges, are scarce, and you have to constantly plant your own. This was a bigger issue in the earlier game when you are limited on your souls, but now with the reduced cost of them and being infinitely available, and making your own vestiges is not an issue. In New Game Plus, where there are no vestiges to fast travel to, careful study of the map and knowledge of the shortcuts plays a key role in getting through each of the areas, and that's pretty cool. That being said, I understand why people complain. It's not because the zones are difficult, nor is there just not enough vestiges. It's because there is no maps, the maps suck. Look, we don't need maps, Souls games don't have maps. You're supposed to just learn the layouts and the shortcuts. But the areas in the Lords of the Fallen are very dense, with a lot of winding paths, and everything looks kind of the same because the color palette's always the same. So it can be very difficult remembering all the little shortcuts and paths, and all the things that kind of randomly open up here or there because you did some, quest trigger. And all the little map pieces they end up giving you to kind of show you the landmarks in the areas do nothing. Has anyone actually gotten any useful information out of those? Like, they show you what a landmark is, but not how to get to it. So it's like, it does nothing. It's a minor annoyance, I know. I just got lost a few times, and I just could not for the life of me figure out where to go, or where I had been and just needed to go back to. But also because the NPCs don't tell you anything either. And speaking of the NPCs, they suck. All of them. They provide nothing useful or interesting to say. They do nothing for the story or the lore. There, I said it, they're awful. Don't care about the NPCs. And the last bit of combat I wanted to talk about is the PvP. Yes, there are invasions and PvP, but the netcode is so awful that it's just a laggy mess. It's not good. Co-op is fine. I do like the co-op in this game, but people are complaining that the hosts are the only ones that get progression when you go through bosses and stuff. And that was, a big selling point of the game was like, it was saying, hey, we have seamless co-op, like other Souls games don't do that. But it's really not. It works just like any other Souls games. You summon a friend, you do the host side content and bosses, then you swap to the other player's game and do it again. I don't have a problem with it, but I get the issue and why people are kind of upset about it. Now, I know a lot of what I said is negative, but it's easier to show what's wrong than what's right because mostly the rights kind of outweigh the wrongs. And all that being said, I really did enjoy my time at Lords of the Fallen. Again, I wouldn't be like making videos and talking about all the things that like I want to criticize if I didn't like the game, which sounds counterintuitive, I know, but like these are the things I feel like, if they improved on, the game would be just great. Like these are the only couple things I have problems with, which is the whole core feature of the Umbral. But anyway, the whole combat loop feels nice, and that's the biggest part of these games. And while I wish we had more enemy variety, and I wish the player power creep wasn't so crazy, because I feel like I have to forcibly limit my power, because otherwise you just steamroll the game, I still think Lords of the Fallen is a fantastic Souls game. Sure, it has some jank here and there with the terrain and some weird issues and stuff, but what game doesn't these days, especially Souls games? And if you're a fan of Souls games, I'd still definitely recommend Lords of the Fallen. I think this is one of the best Souls-like games we've ever gotten. And between this, Lies of P, Elden Ring, and upcoming DLC, we've been eating good for a while. I'm looking forward to seeing the updates and the DLC for this game for sure, because I'm going to keep on it. But that's going to be all for me. Thank you all for watching, and thank you to my Patreon members. I always appreciate you all. If anyone wants to talk shop about gaming or whatever, feel free to join my Discord in the description below. But yeah, peace and good luck out there, hunters.